This is Creepy, a podcast dedicated to sharing the most famous, chilling, and disturbing creepypastas and urban legends in the world. Whether these stories truly happened or are simply fabrications is for you to decide. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Creepy presents Knock Knock, written by ViciousMock and narrated by JV Hampton-VanSant.
If I were to describe my family in one word, it would be prepared. That's the nice way to put it. Some may have said paranoid or dysfunctional. As a family, we regularly practice what to do in emergencies. By the time my sister and I were 5, our evacuation time, parents, children, and dog, was down to 23 seconds. I know what you're thinking. Sounds like good parenting, right? You gotta teach your kids what to do in emergencies. Well, people thought we were strange, I guess. The neighbor once called the police when they saw our parents dangling us out of the window. They were teaching us what to do if we needed to evacuate, and the stairs were blocked. That one took some explaining. There were burglary drills, too, of course. According to our parents, the safest thing for children to do if a burglar came into the house was to pretend to be asleep. And oh, did we practice pretending to be asleep. You don't want to be too still or too straight, you see. It looks unnatural. People tend to sleep in strange positions, especially children. To be convincing, you want your arms and legs at strange angles. Fake snoring isn't the easiest to get right either. Go steady with the snoring. Then there's the issue that if a burglar makes a loud noise, it's unrealistic that you wouldn't even stir. So if that happens, you should stir. Move your head slightly. Smack your lips lightly. A soft groan, before quickly slipping right back into your heavy sleep. But most importantly of all, don't open your eyes. If you open your eyes and see the burglar, they might kill you, so you can't identify them. Good parenting, right? Well, in all the time I was growing up, we never had a house fire and nobody ever tried to burgle us. But if any of those things had happened, you'd bet we would have known what to do. The reason I mention this is to explain why what we were told on our 10th birthday didn't seem all that strange at all. You two aren't little kids anymore. You've grown up so much. Soon, you're gonna notice some changes, Mum said. We exchanged glances, mortified. I mean, school had already told us a little bit about the changes that were going to happen to our bodies. But were Mom and Dad really going to talk to us about it together? I mean, don't dads usually talk to the boys and mums with the girls? Don't get me wrong, Amy and I were close and everything. But I definitely don't want to hear all about that stuff. Girl stuff. I wasn't even sure what the girl stuff was, but I'd heard enough to know it was gross. Soon, and I don't know when, you'll start to hear knocking on the doors of the house. This confused us further. We had always had a strict no-knocking policy in our house. One time, my friend came around for dinner and knocked on the bathroom door to check if it was occupied. Dad went insane. The poor kid was terrified. After that, I was one friend down and clearer than ever that knocking was absolutely not allowed. When this happens, no matter where you are or what you're doing, you must close your eyes. And you must keep them closed. Closed tight. No peeking, no looking, no squinting. Who will be knocking? Burglars? I asked. Much worse than burglars. When you hear the knock, you must close your eyes, and you must keep them closed, Dad said. How long for? At least 5 minutes, to be safe. Why can't you just tell us when it's safe to open them? Said Amy. When the knocking starts, you must not trust anything you hear. Anything. Under no circumstances must you open your eyes until 5 minutes have passed, Dad said. But Danny can't even tell the time, Amy laughed. Shut up. Yes, I can. That was one time. I just thought the little hand was... I started. Enough. Have you listened at all? Dad snapped, silencing us both. How do you think you are going to check the clock without opening your eyes? But then, how do we know? Amy said. Amy was Dad's little princess and was not used to him speaking to her so sternly. You must count, in your head, with your eyes closed, 300 seconds. But to be safe, count to 500. With Mississippi? She asked. Always with Mississippi, Dad said, his tone softening slightly. That will take forever, I complained. Well then, you better get used to it quickly. Let's practice. We didn't practice with real knocking, of course. Over the next few days, our parents would just leap out from nowhere and shout, "Knock, knock!" And we would instantly and immediately close our eyes, whether we were watching TV, reading, or in the bathroom. They'd prepared us for the fact that we might hear strange or upsetting things once the knocking started. They told us we mustn't take any notice. As long as we closed our eyes and kept them closed, it would go away again. I know what you're thinking. Hadn't we noticed growing up that every now and then our parents randomly closed their eyes for 5 minutes? Well, we did. They didn't really explain it. They just told us that whenever it happens, you must stay quiet and wait for them to open them again. And, in the meantime, not to get into any trouble. Our parents stopping and closing their eyes for several minutes was, to us, just one of the weird things that grown-ups did sometimes. Usually, we would just carry on playing, not too concerned. Maybe we would have started to find it weird as we got older, but we didn't have to wait long before we started experiencing it ourselves. It was months before I heard it. Knock, knock. I slammed my eyes shut immediately. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Danny, your dinner's ready, Mom called out. Amy, get your brother, Dad shouted. It's getting cold. 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi. Danny, help me! Amy's voice was piercing, and I scrunched my eyes closed tighter. She's dying, Mom cried out. For God's sakes, Danny, help us! Dad's voice was so loud that I was sure his face was only inches away from mine. 19 Mississippi, 20 Mississippi. Danny, we need to get out. Danny, we need to get out of this house right now. Come with us. I didn't know who was speaking. It was all of them at once, shouting and banging. We're going to have to leave him. It's not safe in here. Danny, you need to come with us. 32 Mississippi, 33 Mississippi. Don't get me wrong, I wanted to open my eyes. I wanted to so badly. But their voices were so close and so real. But all I could think was my dad's warning. Under no circumstances. The awful things I was hearing frightened me, but made me more determined to just keep counting. I lost count several times, somewhere in the 300s and the 400s, so I went back to the last number I remembered saying in my head just to be safe. Looking back, I imagine I sat there with my eyes scrunched tight, my hands clasped over my ears for at least 20 minutes. When I felt safe to open them again, Mom, Dad, and Amy were all next to me, staring at me. I burst into tears. Amy looked confused. I knew immediately that she hadn't heard the knocking. She looked a bit frightened, too. In the past, it was our parents that would close their eyes, and we never thought much of it. But there she was, on her own. The rest of us sat with our eyes closed, while she just watched and wondered when she would start hearing it, too. Mom and Dad both hugged me, which was a rarity for them. Then Amy started crying and joined the hug too. They told me I'd done so well and that they were proud of me. I didn't feel proud of myself at all. I just remember thinking that I wanted to go back to being a little kid forever and never hear the knocking again. "What did you hear?" Amy whispered to me that night. Our room was small and our beds were close enough that we could whisper to each other easily. Mom and Dad had told us that soon they were going to turn the home office into another bedroom because in a little while we wouldn't want to share a room anymore. When they told us, we were both relieved. As much as Amy and I got along, we were getting older and sharing the space was getting more difficult. But that night, I was glad she was there. I wasn't sure how to answer. I didn't want to scare her by telling her exactly what I'd heard. Yet, I also wanted her to be prepared. Our parents hadn't told us exactly what to expect. Just that we might hear scary or upsetting things, and that it was the knocking, trying to trick us to open our eyes. I wondered whether it would have been better or worse if they'd been more specific to prepare me. I didn't know. It was scary, Amy. It's hard not to open your eyes. It's really hard. When it happens, just keep counting. Don't believe anything you hear. She sniffed, and I realized she was crying again. In a way, seeing it happen to me and seeing how upset I got afterwards seemed to scare her more than anything. Or maybe she was scared of the unknown, realizing it would start happening to her soon and she didn't know when. She dealt with the first time quite well, considering. I wasn't sure what she heard, but for me, it was even worse than the first time. I heard banging and thudding, and our dog whimpering and crying. I heard laughing, although I couldn't tell whose voice it was. When I did open my eyes, our dog was, of course, napping on the couch, legs sprawled out, content as could be. Mom and Dad's eyes were already open. They probably didn't count all the way to 500 like we had to. Presumably, we were given the number 500 to be completely sure that we didn't open them too early. And I counted as honestly and carefully as I could every time, which meant that I never opened my eyes before they did. Amy must have taken it seriously too, because her eyes stayed closed a couple minutes longer. She didn't cry afterwards like I had, but she was quiet for the rest of the night. Our parents ordered pizza that night, and they even let us order our own mini individual pizzas so we didn't have to argue about toppings. But Amy just nibbled at hers and said she wasn't hungry. When I whispered goodnight to her that night, she just rolled over without answering. But not long after, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her sobbing into her pillow. I didn't say anything. Maybe I should have, but I didn't want her to know I'd heard. As distressing as the situation was, the knocking only happened once every few months. So, in between that, we lived life as normal. Or at least as normal as it could be in a family like ours. Our parents had told us that we only needed to close our eyes when we heard knocking at home. But it was hard not to do it instinctively. One day at school, another teacher came to our classroom to ask Mrs. Thorpe if he could borrow some calculators. He knocked on the classroom door before walking in, and I instinctively closed my eyes and covered my ears. As I sat there with my eyes closed and thought about it, I knew I didn't have to do this at school, but I couldn't bring myself to open them in case I was remembering wrong, or in case maybe Dad had been wrong. I was, understandably looking back, simply terrified at that point of the sound of knocking. Of course, I didn't hear the awful things I heard when it happened at home. I just heard my teacher calling to get my attention, asking if I was going to sleep, and the other kids laughing. Still, I couldn't bring myself to open my eyes until I reached 500. My parents were called in to discuss my concerning behavior, but they downplayed it to the school as me going through a phase of rebellious behavior. The school dropped it, of course. It wasn't like I'd done anything wrong, really. I wasn't in trouble exactly. They were just worried and confused. I'd already been known as somewhat of a weird kid, and this incident cemented my reputation. I had a couple of friends, but they weren't close friends, and they weren't the kind of friends I'd invite for dinner or anything. I guess that suited my parents since it made everything easier. Amy was different. Amy seemed to change after the first time she heard it. Or maybe it was nothing to do with that. Maybe it was just growing up. But the girl who had cried and hugged me after the first time I heard the knocking disappeared. She became popular at school, and soon liked to argue with Mom and Dad about everything and anything. If they told her we were having chicken for dinner, she only wanted pork. If they told her she was getting 100 pounds, she wanted 200. If they told her the sky was blue, it was green. Amy and I didn't argue, really, but we became distant. She didn't seem to dislike me exactly. If anything, she seemed completely indifferent to me, which hurt more. When I tried to speak to her about anything, she'd seem awkward and embarrassed, like I was a stranger to her. With my lack of friends, not having a sister to talk to made me feel lonelier than ever. I was hospitalized for severe depression at age 14. I won't go into details, but it was a bad time in my life. I don't even have many memories of the hospital. The ones I do have are dreamlike and distant, and I'm not sure if they were even real. Nevertheless, eventually, I was deemed healthy enough to get out. I remember that day clearly, because when our parents came to pick me up, Amy came too, and she ran over and hugged me, really hugged me, like she did when we were kids. The car ride home could not have been more different than the car ride in. Our parents put on the radio and we all sang cheesy pop songs. Amy sat in the back with me and chatted away to me about her friend's new boyfriend and the new skirt she'd bought that Dad wouldn't let her wear in public because he said it looked like a belt. I remember looking in the mirror to see Mom and Dad's reactions and seeing how they smiled as they listened to Amy complain about them to me as if they weren't there. I spent the car ride home in a state of euphoria. We were in the living room that evening watching a movie. Our parents had let me choose the movie, and Amy hadn't argued at all. She just smiled and told me that it was a great choice, even though I knew she couldn't have hated it more. I was on my second slice of pizza when it happened. Knock, knock. All four of us closed our eyes in unison. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Please, please stop. Get off me. You're hurting me. I ignored the sound of Mom's desperate voice the best I could. She's okay. This isn't real. 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi. You're a fucking embarrassment, said Amy's voice. Nobody likes you, you know. We're all just pretending so you don't end up going all batshit crazy again. You're going to have to do better than that. I'm not opening my eyes. 11 Mississippi, 12 Mississippi. This time wasn't as bad as it had been before. I thought of the rest of my family, knowing they were all counting too. I wondered what number they were all up to. I could hear the movie still playing in the background and tried to concentrate on this story. 374 Mississippi, 375 Mississippi. Amy, what have you done? No, help her, Gary. The main character in the movie had just found out that her new boyfriend was actually her half-brother, as they'd been born from the same sperm donor. It wasn't a very good twist, since there had been no hints whatsoever leading up to this moment. It was a bit disappointing. I wondered whether Amy would continue pretending to like it after that. 456 Mississippi, 457 Mississippi. When I opened my eyes, I knew immediately that something was wrong. Mom and Dad didn't look over at me at all. They were crowded around Amy, who was sitting on the floor in silence, staring straight ahead, as if looking right through them both. I don't know what Amy heard that time that made her open her eyes. I don't know why that time was different compared to all the other times. I just know that after that, Amy was gone forever. She wasn't dead. No, it was worse than that. That might seem like a horrible thing to say, but it's true. Never again did Amy smile or complain or argue. In fact, she never spoke another word. She was still alive for all intents and purposes, but she wasn't really. She would eat when food was put to her lips. My mom had to shower her and take her to the bathroom and put her to bed. They had to take her to a doctor, of course. The doctors concluded that there was no evidence of any injuries or damage to her brain at all. They were simply baffled. I remember Mom and Dad getting several visits from social services. Luckily, the knocking didn't happen when the social workers were there. I remember a lot of hospital visits with a lot of different doctors. But in the end, nobody knew what was wrong with Amy or what could be done to help. I changed then. I stopped being the weird, quiet kid. I got angry, you see. It was okay when the other kids at school were making fun of me, but when they started making fun of my sister, I had to teach them a lesson. After several fights, I was excluded from school and had to go to a specialist school for those with behavioral problems, with small class sizes and a lot of security in place. I was angry at everyone, really. I was angry at Amy for opening her eyes. I was angry at myself for being in hospital and missing out on the time I could have spent with Amy in the last months of her being herself. I was angry at my parents, too. I couldn't even articulate what I was angry about. I blamed them for the whole knocking thing, whatever it was. They'd never been able to explain what it was, or what it meant, or what had happened to Amy when she opened her eyes. My anger turned into a burning hatred of them. They didn't deserve it, really, but I needed to blame someone and I couldn't bear to blame myself. Once I was old enough to move out and live alone, I sort of got my life together. I mean, I got my life together in the sense that I didn't end up in prison or dead. Life became much easier without the knocking and without the constant reminder of what happened to Amy. I got myself a minimum wage job where I was treated like shit for 8 hours a day and got my girlfriend knocked up when we were both far too young, but still, better than I expected to turn out. I didn't visit my parents again, which is something I deeply regret. They continued caring for Amy, who never recovered, until the day they died. Ironically enough, considering their preparedness, they died in a house fire. Amy survived because she'd been taken to the zoo by one of my parents' friendly neighbors in order to give my parents a rest. When they came back and found out what happened, Amy apparently didn't flinch or react at all. So, Amy moved in, with me, into my shitty apartment. I was a bit ashamed that I hadn't seen her in years, but to be honest, I'm convinced that she isn't even in there anymore, so she's not aware of whether I've been to visit her or not. It's not the personal care that bothers me, or the way she still stares straight ahead, as if she's looking right through you. Those things were difficult to get used to, but I did get used to them. What bothers me the most is that ever since she's moved in, I've been hearing knocking. Knock, knock. I close my eyes. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. You did this to me. It's Amy's voice, a voice I haven't heard in so long. 4 Mississippi. 5 Mississippi. I'd forgotten how long counting to 500 Mississippi takes. It's definitely much, much longer than 5 minutes. Anyway, it's the weekend, which means my daughter will be getting dropped off here soon. She's going to turn 10 next week, so I guess I'm going to have to explain to her about the knocking.